Cute little place, Margaret. I guess some people never outgrow starter homes. My daughter-in-law Brittany said it with a smile. Everyone laughed, including my son. 3 months later, those same people were asking for a key to the front door. But that's getting ahead of the story. I'm glad you're here. Follow my story until the end, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Sometimes I wonder how far stories like mine travel. I've always believed a home should make people feel safe. Not impressed, not jealous, not amazed, just safe. For 30 years, my little white cottage on Willow Creek Road had done exactly that. It wasn't large. It wasn't modern. It certainly wasn't the kind of place that appeared in luxury home magazines. But every board, every window, every flower bed carried a memory. My husband Walter and I bought the property when we were both in our 30s. Back then, we could barely afford it. The roof leaked. The plumbing groaned. The kitchen looked like something from another decade. But it was ours. And over the years, we fixed it piece by piece. One paycheck at a time. One weekend at a time. One dream at a time. After Walter passed away 5 years ago, the house became more than a house. It became proof that our life together had happened. Every room still held traces of him. The wooden shelves he built. The stone pathway he laid with his own hands. The porch swing where we'd spent countless summer evenings watching the sun disappear behind the trees. That Saturday afternoon, I was genuinely excited. My son Ethan had called earlier in the week. Mind if we come by for a family barbecue, Mom? I nearly dropped the phone. Ethan had been busy lately. Or at least that's what Brittany always said. Work, travel, social events, life. The usual explanations. So hearing that they wanted to spend time together felt special. I cleaned the house from top to bottom. I polished the dining table, trimmed the roses, made Ethan's favorite potato salad. At 68, I moved slower than I once had. But that morning, I felt 20 years younger. By noon, cars started arriving. My niece Claire, a few cousins, some family friends, and finally, Ethan and Brittany. Brittany stepped out of her SUV wearing oversized sunglasses and an expression that suggested she had accidentally taken a wrong turn into another century. She stood in the driveway and looked at the cottage. Then she laughed softly. Not the kind laugh people make when they're happy. The kind they make when they're judging. Oh wow. She removed her sunglasses. It's even smaller than I remembered. A few people chuckled. I forced a smile. It's cozy. Brittany tilted her head. That's certainly one word for it. More laughter. A small moment. The kind that can be dismissed. The kind people tell you not to take personally. So I didn't. At least not yet. The afternoon continued. Burgers on the grill. Children running through the yard. Conversations drifting across the porch. For a while, I convinced myself I'd imagined the tension. Then Brittany walked into my living room. She looked around slowly. At the bookshelves. At the fireplace. At Walter's old armchair. Then she crossed her arms. Cute little place, Margaret. Another smile. Another pause. I guess some people never outgrow starter homes. This time the laughter was louder. I noticed Ethan grinning into his drink. Not uncomfortable. Not embarrassed. Amused. Something inside my chest tightened. But I stayed quiet. I've learned that people reveal more when you let them keep talking. Unfortunately, Brittany wasn't finished. A few minutes later, she pointed toward the hallway. Our walk-in closet is almost this size. Someone snorted. Someone else laughed into their cup. And just like that, my home became the afternoon's entertainment. The strange thing wasn't the insult. It was Ethan, my son, the little boy who once built blanket forts in this very living room. The little boy who used to tell everyone his house was the best house in the world. He said nothing. Not one word. Not once. The barbecue finally ended near sunset. Guests began leaving. The driveway slowly emptied. I carried a tray toward the kitchen when I heard voices outside the side porch. Ethan and Brittany. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but my name stopped me. Do you think she'll ever figure it out? Ethan asked. There was a brief silence. Then Brittany laughed. Not the playful laugh she'd used all afternoon. This one sounded colder. Sharper. Trust me, she said. Just wait. I froze. Figure what out? Wait for what? Before I could hear anything else, a car door slammed. The conversation ended. A few minutes later, Brittany came back inside. Everyone else had already left. She stood alone in my living room, completely silent. Her eyes moved across the walls, across the windows, across the framed property map hanging above the fireplace. And suddenly something changed. The mockery disappeared. The amusement disappeared. The contempt disappeared. For the first time all day, Brittany wasn't looking at my house like it was small. She was looking at it like she wanted something, and for reasons I couldn't yet explain. That frightened me far more than the laughter ever had. That night, I barely slept. Not because of Brittany's jokes. Not even because Ethan had laughed along with them. It was that look. The one she'd given the property map before leaving. I had seen greed before. I'd worked at the public library for nearly 40 years. People assume librarians only deal with books. They don't. You learn to read people. You notice when someone wants knowledge. You notice when someone wants power. And Brittany had looked at that map like it contained something she desperately wanted. Around 2 in the morning, I got out of bed and walked downstairs. The house was silent. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked steadily. Walter used to say that sound made the house feel alive. Now it mostly reminded me how empty the rooms had become. I stood in front of the property map hanging above the fireplace. The same map Brittany had stared at. The property lines. The wooded acres. The small lake access point near the eastern edge. Nothing had changed. At least, not that I knew of. I shook my head. Maybe I was imagining things. Maybe Brittany was simply being Brittany. For years, I tried to give her the benefit of the doubt. It was becoming harder. The following morning, I sat on the front porch with a cup of coffee. The air smelled like pine trees and fresh grass. One of the reasons Walter loved this place so much. People often focused on the cottage itself. The size, the age, the outdated kitchen. They rarely noticed what surrounded it. 22 acres of land. Rolling hills. Mature maple trees. A private creek. And enough distance from the nearest neighbor to hear birds instead of traffic. Walter used to call it our little piece of heaven. Most people only saw the house. They never looked beyond it. Especially Brittany. Or so I thought. 3 days later, something happened that made me reconsider everything. I was checking my mailbox when I found a large envelope wedged between utility bills and grocery coupons. The return address belonged to a real estate company. I frowned. I almost tossed it aside. Over the years, countless developers had mailed advertisements hoping to buy land in the area. Most of them went straight into the trash. But this envelope felt different. Heavier. Official. I carried it inside and set it on the kitchen table. For nearly an hour, I ignored it. I watered my plants, folded laundry, cleaned the dishes, anything to avoid opening it. Finally, curiosity won. I slid a butter knife under the seal. Inside was a formal purchase proposal. I adjusted my reading glasses. Then I read the number. Twice. 3 times. I thought there had to be a mistake. The amount was larger than I had earned during my entire career. My hands became strangely cold. I looked out the kitchen window toward the back field. The same field Walter once mowed every Saturday. Why would anyone pay that much? I read the letter again. Then again. There was no explanation. Only interest. Strong interest. The kind that usually meant someone knew something you didn't. For the first time, Brittany's behavior started fitting into a larger picture. Not enough to make sense. Just enough to make me uncomfortable. That evening, I drove into town and met my neighbor Harold at the diner. Harold had lived in Willow Creek longer than anyone I knew. If something was happening around here, he'd know. We sat in our usual booth. I showed him the letter. His eyebrows nearly disappeared into his hairline. Well, he said slowly. Looks like they're moving faster than I expected. I lowered my coffee cup. What does that mean? Harold glanced around before lowering his voice. Developers. My stomach tightened. What developers? The resort people. I stared at him. The what? He leaned back. You really don't know? Apparently, I didn't. According to Harold, several investment groups had spent the past year quietly purchasing land throughout the county. Old farms, woodlets, vacant acreage, anything near the lake. The plan, according to rumors, was to build an upscale waterfront resort community. Golf courses, vacation homes, luxury amenities. Millions of dollars flowing into a town that had barely changed in decades. I felt a chill despite the warm coffee in my hands. And my property? Harold hesitated. Then he nodded. Your property sits right in the middle of the area they're targeting. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The noise of the diner seemed to fade away. I suddenly remembered Brittany staring at the map. The questions she had asked months earlier. The unusual interest she'd shown in property taxes. The way she'd casually asked whether I planned to leave the land to Ethan someday. At the time, I thought she was making conversation. Now I wasn't so sure. When I returned home, the cottage felt different. Not because the walls had changed. Not because the land had changed. Because my understanding of it had changed. I sat alone in Walter's old armchair and stared at the darkness outside. The purchase proposal remained on the coffee table, untouched. The number still felt unreal. Then my phone rang. 11:37 p.m. I looked at the screen. Ethan. My son hadn't called that late in months. Maybe years. I answered. Hello. His voice sounded unusually cheerful. Hey, Mom. Just wanted to check on you. I sat up straighter. Check on me. The words should have felt comforting. Instead, they felt strange. Calculated. Almost rehearsed. We talked for a few minutes. Nothing important. The weather. My garden. The barbecue. Then there was a brief pause. And Ethan asked a question that made every alarm bell in my head start ringing. Mom, he said casually. You still own all that land around the house, right? I didn't answer. Immediately. Because suddenly, I wanted to know why he was asking. And for the first time in a very long time, I wasn't sure I trusted the answer. I didn't answer Ethan's question right away. Mom, you still own all that land around the house, right? His voice sounded casual. Too casual. The kind of casual people use when they've rehearsed something beforehand. I stared through the living room window into the darkness outside. The maple trees swayed gently in the night breeze. Trees Ethan used to climb when he was 10. Trees Walter planted with his own hands. Trees nobody had cared about for decades. Until now. Why do you ask? I said. A brief silence followed. Only a second, but long enough for me to notice. Oh, nothing, Ethan replied. Just curious. Curious. That was the word he chose. Not concerned. Not interested. Curious. We exchanged a few more meaningless sentences before ending the call. The moment I put the phone down, I knew something had changed. I just didn't know how much. The next morning, I tried convincing myself I was overthinking everything. After all, Ethan was my son. My only child. Maybe Harold's information had made me suspicious. Maybe Brittany's behavior had colored my judgment. Maybe there was an innocent explanation. That theory lasted exactly 24 hours. The following afternoon, my phone rang again. Ethan. Hey, Mom. His voice was cheerful. Almost unusually cheerful. We were thinking about stopping by tomorrow. I blinked. We? Me and Brittany. That surprised me. The last time they'd visited twice in 1 week was probably years ago. Sure, I said. The next day, they arrived carrying gifts. Gifts? I nearly laughed. Brittany stepped out of the SUV holding a bakery box. Ethan carried a bouquet of flowers. For a moment, I honestly wondered if they had the wrong address. These are for you, Brittany said warmly. Warmly. The same woman who had mocked my home 4 days earlier. The same woman who had compared my living room to her closet. Now she was smiling like a contestant in a toothpaste commercial. I thanked them and invited them inside. Something felt off immediately. Not hostile. Not uncomfortable. Performative. Like actors trying too hard to remember their lines. Brittany complimented the house 3 separate times within the first 15 minutes. 3. I counted. Oh, this place has so much charm. Look at these original wood floors. I've always loved homes with character. Homes with character. Interesting phrase. A week earlier she had called it a starter home. Now it had character. Apparently the property value had developed a personality. I smiled politely and poured coffee. The conversation drifted from topic to topic. Nothing unusual. Until Brittany casually asked about the back acreage. How much land do you actually own? There it was. The question. The real reason for the visit. I stirred my coffee slowly. About 22 acres. Her eyebrows lifted. She already knew that. I was certain of it. Yet she acted surprised. Wow, that's incredible. Ethan nodded. That's a lot of land, Mom. Funny. For years neither of them had cared. Now suddenly they sounded impressed. A few minutes later, another question appeared. Then another. Then another. Property taxes. Maintenance costs. Boundary lines. Access roads. Development restrictions. The conversation felt less like a family visit and more like an interview. I answered carefully, giving information, but not too much. By the time they left, my suspicions had grown considerably. What happened next removed almost all doubt. 3 days later, Ethan called again. Then again. Then again. Every day? Without fail. Good morning texts. Funny articles. Pictures of his dog. Questions about my health. Questions about my garden. Questions about my schedule. At first glance it looked thoughtful. A loving son reconnecting with his mother. But something wasn't right. Because genuine relationships don't appear overnight, especially after years of distance. One afternoon, I sat at my kitchen table scrolling through old photos, family vacations, birthdays, Christmas mornings, and suddenly I realized something painful. The previous year, Ethan had forgotten my birthday. Completely. No phone call, no card, no text message, nothing. 2 weeks later, he apologized. Claimed work had been overwhelming. Now that same man was calling me. Every single day. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Then Brittany surprised me again. On Sunday morning, she showed up unannounced carrying a homemade apple pie. I almost dropped the door handle. Brittany didn't bake. She proudly didn't bake. I'd heard her say it countless times. Life's too short to spend it in a kitchen. Yet there she stood smiling with a pie balanced carefully in her hands. I thought you might enjoy this. I accepted it, thanked her, and wondered what game we were all playing. Because at this point, even the kindness felt uncomfortable. Especially the kindness. That evening, I carried a slice of pie to Harold's porch. He took one bite and laughed. What? This woman really wants something. I laughed despite myself. Then his expression changed. The smile disappeared. Margaret, what? You need to be careful. I set my fork down. Why? Harold looked toward the dark outline of my property beyond the trees. Then he said something that sent a chill through me. I heard another developer made an offer yesterday. My stomach tightened. On my land. He nodded. Not just your land. He paused. They're specifically interested in the parcel around your house. For several seconds I couldn't speak. Because suddenly all the pieces were starting to connect. The phone calls. The gifts. The compliments. The pie. The sudden affection. And if I was right, none of it had anything to do with me. As I drove home that night, headlights sweeping across the empty road, one question repeated itself over and over in my mind. Had Ethan and Brittany discovered something about my property before I did? And if they had, how long had they been pretending? That night, I didn't turn on the television. I didn't read. I didn't even finish my tea. I just sat in Walter's old armchair, staring at the purchase proposal on the coffee table. The paper hadn't changed. The number hadn't changed. But my understanding of it had. For days, I'd been asking the wrong question. I kept asking why developers wanted my land. Now I was starting to ask something else. How long had Ethan and Brittany known? The next morning, I made a phone call. A friend of mine from church had a nephew who worked in commercial real estate. His name was Daniel. I'd met him only twice before. By lunchtime, we were sitting in a small office in town. I slid the proposal across his desk. Daniel read it carefully. Then he leaned back in his chair. Mrs. Dawson, he said, I hope you haven't signed anything. I shook my head. No. Good. His tone immediately caught my attention. Why? He tapped the paper. Because they're offering far below what they think your property is worth. I stared at him. For a moment, I thought I'd misunderstood. Far below. He nodded. Much lower. The room suddenly felt warmer. How much lower? Daniel hesitated. Then he gave me a number. I honestly thought I had heard him incorrectly. The amount was nearly triple the offer sitting on his desk. Triple. I looked down at the proposal again. A week earlier, I would have considered it life-changing money. Now it looked like bait. The first piece of bait. As I drove home, I found myself remembering dozens of little conversations I'd dismissed over the past year. Questions Brittany had asked. Comments she'd made. Things that seemed harmless at the time. One memory surfaced immediately. 6 months earlier, Brittany had asked if I planned to update my will. At the time, I thought she was helping. Now I wasn't so sure. Another memory followed. 3 months ago, she'd casually asked whether I'd ever considered selling the back acreage. Again, I hadn't thought much of it. Now every memory felt different, like puzzle pieces suddenly fitting together. That evening, I started looking through old emails, tax records, property notices, letters from the county. I wasn't searching for anything specific, just trying to understand, trying to see what I had missed. And then I found it. A public planning notice, dated almost 8 months earlier. I opened the document. My eyes moved slowly across the page. Rezoning discussions, infrastructure expansion, road improvements, future development corridors. The language was technical, boring even, but one detail stood out. The highlighted area included my property. Directly. Not nearby. Not adjacent. Directly. I sat back in my chair. 8 months. This information had been public for 8 months. 8 months. Suddenly, I remembered another conversation. A family dinner. Brittany sitting across from me, smiling, asking questions about land ownership. property taxes, future inheritance plans. At the time, I thought she was making polite conversation. Now the timeline looked very different. A cold feeling settled into my stomach. Because if I could find this information in a single evening, then someone actively looking for development opportunities would have found it long before me. Far earlier. Far easier. I wasn't proving anything yet, but I was beginning to suspect something. Something ugly. The next afternoon, my suspicion grew stronger. I stopped by the grocery store. Nothing unusual. Just milk, bread, and a few vegetables. As I loaded groceries into my trunk, I heard someone call my name. Margaret. I turned around. It was Linda Foster, a retired schoolteacher who knew nearly everyone in the county. We exchanged small talk for a few minutes. Then she asked a question that made me freeze. How are Ethan and Brittany handling all this? I frowned. Handling what? Linda looked confused. The development project. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she said something that nearly stopped my heart. Oh, her face changed. You don't know. I felt a knot tighten inside my chest. Know what? Linda immediately looked uncomfortable. The kind of uncomfortable people get when they accidentally reveal something they shouldn't. I just assumed Ethan told you. Told me what? She glanced away, then back at me. He's been attending some of the community planning meetings. The parking lot suddenly felt very quiet. What meetings? The development meetings. I stared at her. She continued. Him and Brittany. I didn't say anything. Couldn't. Because in that moment, every strange interaction from the past several weeks came rushing back. The gifts, the compliments, the daily phone calls, the sudden concern, the homemade pie, the questions, all of it. Not random, not coincidence. Connected. Linda kept talking, but I barely heard her. My mind was somewhere else. One thought repeating over and over. They knew. At the very least, they knew far more than they had admitted. When I finally arrived home, I sat in my driveway for nearly 10 minutes. The cottage stood exactly where it always had. Quiet, modest, unchanged. But now I understood something Brittany had figured out long ago. People weren't looking at my house anymore. They were looking underneath it. At the land. At the future value. At the opportunity. And for the first time, I began to wonder whether Brittany had ever truly seen me at all. Or if she'd only ever seen what she thought she could eventually own. Then my phone buzzed. A text message from Ethan. Just one sentence. Short. Simple. Harmless on the surface. Mom, Brittany and I were wondering if we could come by this weekend and talk about the future. I stared at the message. The future. Not family. Not memories. Not me. The future. And suddenly I had a feeling I already knew exactly which future they wanted to discuss. I didn't respond to Ethan's text immediately. Mom, Brittany and I were wondering if we could come by this weekend and talk about the future. I read it 3 times. The future. It was a careful choice of words. Vague enough to sound harmless. Specific enough to hide a purpose. Finally, I replied. Of course. His response arrived almost instantly. Great. Can't wait to see you. That was unusual. Lately, everything about Ethan had become unusual. Saturday arrived with clear skies and warm sunshine. Around noon, their SUV pulled into my driveway. I watched from the kitchen window. Brittany stepped out carrying a gift bag. Again, another gift. Another performance. When I opened the front door, she wrapped her arms around me. Actually hugged me. For a second, I almost forgot who she was. Almost. You look wonderful, Margaret. Margaret. Not Mom. Not Mrs. Dawson. Margaret. The voice was sweet. Polished. Practiced. Inside, she immediately began complimenting the house. Again, the same house she'd mocked just weeks earlier. Oh, I absolutely love this living room. I nodded. Interesting. A month ago it had been too small. Now she loved it. A few minutes later she walked through the kitchen. I've always admired homes with this kind of character. I nearly smiled. Always admired. That was a new version of history. Then she paused beside the dining room window. The one overlooking the back acreage. The one with the best view of the property. Her eyes lingered there longer than necessary. Long enough for me to notice. Long enough for me to remember. People reveal themselves when they think no one is watching. Lunch felt strangely formal. Too polite. Too careful. Every sentence seemed rehearsed. Every compliment seemed measured. Finally, Ethan cleared his throat. Mom. There it was. The real reason for the visit. I set down my coffee cup. Yes. He exchanged a quick glance with Brittany. The kind married couple share when they've discussed something beforehand. We've been thinking. Dangerous words. Very dangerous words. We worry about you living out here alone. I remained silent. He continued. The property's large. Maintenance is expensive. There's a lot of responsibility. Each sentence sounded reasonable. Individually. Together, they sounded like a sales pitch. Brittany leaned forward. We just want what's best for you. The sentence landed softly, almost gently, but something beneath it felt hard, calculated. I had heard versions of that sentence before, usually right before somebody asked for something. What are you suggesting? I asked. Another glance passed between them. Then Brittany smiled. We were thinking maybe we could spend more time here. More time here. Not with me. Here. A small difference. An important difference. I noticed it immediately. Ethan nodded. Maybe weekends at first. The room became very quiet. I could almost hear Walter laughing somewhere in the distance. Not because the idea was absurd, because the timing was. For years they barely visited. Now suddenly they wanted regular access to the property. The same property developers were aggressively pursuing. What a coincidence. Or maybe not. The conversation drifted elsewhere for a while. Family stories. The weather. My garden. Then Brittany casually asked a question. One simple question. But it told me more than anything else that day. Do you still have the spare house key? I looked directly at her. For the first time, her smile faltered slightly. Just slightly. Enough. The spare key? Yes. Her voice remained light. I was just thinking it might be useful in case of emergencies. Emergencies? Of course. Everything was always for my benefit. Everything was always about helping, protecting, supporting. Funny how those words appeared whenever valuable property entered the conversation. I smiled politely. Oh, I think I misplaced it years ago. A lie. The key was exactly where it had always been. Inside Walter's old desk drawer. Safe. Forgotten. And staying there. For a fraction of a second, disappointment flashed across Brittany's face. Gone almost immediately. But not before I saw it. Not before I understood. The conversation continued. Yet something had changed. The masks were slipping. Tiny cracks were appearing. As the afternoon ended, Ethan helped carry dishes into the kitchen. For a brief moment we were alone. Just mother and son. No Brittany. No audience. No performance. I decided to test something. Ethan. He looked up. Have you attended any development meetings recently? His reaction lasted less than a second. But it was enough. His shoulders stiffened. His eyes widened. Then he recovered. Too quickly. What? The county planning meetings. Oh. He laughed. A little too loudly. A couple. A couple. Interesting. Linda had implied there were many. Why didn't you mention that? He shrugged. Didn't seem important. Didn't seem important. The largest development project in county history. The project affecting my property directly. Apparently not important. I nodded. But inside, another piece clicked into place. Later that evening, after they left, I walked outside. The sun was setting over the western hills. Golden lights spread across the fields. The same fields Walter loved. The same fields everyone suddenly seemed interested in. As I stood there, my phone buzzed. A notification. One of those public real estate websites. Normally I ignored them. This time I opened it. And froze. Because according to the activity history, someone had viewed information connected to my property nearly every day for the past month. Every day? Far more than normal. Far more than random interest. I stared at the screen. Then I remembered Brittany asking for the key. I remembered Ethan attending development meetings. I remembered the gifts. The compliments. The pie. The phone calls. And for the first time, a frightening thought crossed my mind. What if they weren't trying to convince me to sell? What if they were planning something much bigger? Something that required access. Access to the house. Access to the land. Access to me. And suddenly, I wasn't worried about what they wanted. I was worried about how far they were willing to go to get it. After that evening, I stopped giving people the benefit of the doubt. Not because I had become bitter, because I had finally started paying attention. There's a difference. For years, I had explained away every uncomfortable feeling, every strange comment, every moment that didn't quite make sense. I told myself I was imagining things. I told myself family deserved trust. Now I wasn't so sure. 3 days after Brittany asked for the spare key, Ethan called again. His timing had become remarkably predictable, almost scheduled. Hey, Mom. His voice sounded unusually upbeat. What are you up to? I smiled to myself. For most of my life, Ethan had hated small talk. Now he suddenly wanted details about my day. I'm gardening. That's great. A brief pause followed. Then came the real reason for the call. We've been talking about something. Of course they had. We. Me and Brittany. There it was again. Always we. Never him. Never alone. I sat down on the porch swing. Walter's porch swing. What kind of something? Another pause. Longer this time. Then Ethan finally said it. We've been thinking about moving. I waited. He continued. Maybe somewhere quieter. The swing creaked softly beneath me. Somewhere quieter. Interesting choice of words. Because there wasn't much quieter than 22 acres in rural Vermont. I said nothing. Eventually Ethan added the part he had clearly been working toward. Actually, we were wondering what you'd think about us staying with you for a while. There it was. Finally. Not hidden. Not disguised. Not wrapped in concern. The request. I looked out. Across the backfield. The same field developers suddenly wanted. The same field Brittany suddenly admired. The same field Ethan suddenly found peaceful. What do you mean by a while? Oh, you know. His voice sounded casual. A few months. A few months. The phrase landed heavily. People who say a few months are rarely talking about a few months. They're talking about something much longer. Something harder to reverse. I didn't answer immediately. And Ethan noticed. We'd help around the property. We'd take care of things. We'd make life easier. The sales pitch had begun. Again. Helping. Supporting. Taking care. The same words. Always the same words. I told him I'd think about it. Then ended the call. That weekend they arrived unexpectedly. Again. The frequency of their visits was becoming impossible to ignore. This time Brittany carried a large folder. Not a purse. Not a gift. A folder. That alone made me nervous. We sat in the kitchen. Coffee cups between us. For a few minutes, everything seemed normal. Then Brittany opened the folder. And my stomach tightened. Inside were floor plans. Detailed floor plans. Not for a new house. For mine. My house. I stared at the pages. Room measurements. Renovation sketches. Furniture layouts. Color schemes. Entire sections covered with notes. I slowly turned another page. Then another. The more I looked, the stranger it became. Because none of the plans reflected how I lived. They reflected how Brittany wanted to live. The guest bedroom had been expanded. The study had been converted. The storage room had disappeared entirely. Even the kitchen had been redesigned. As if someone had already decided the house belonged to them. Brittany smiled. We've been brainstorming. Brainstorming. An innocent word. Until you realize someone is redesigning your life without asking permission. I carefully placed the pages back on the table. You've certainly put a lot of thought into this. Her face brightened. Exactly the reaction she'd hoped for. Then I reached the final page. And everything suddenly became crystal clear. At the top of the page, written neatly in blue ink, were 3 words. Future Master Suite. My eyes moved. Slowly across the paper. The room identified as the future master suite was my bedroom. Walter's bedroom. The room we'd shared for nearly 40 years. The room where he took his last breath. The room that still held his photographs. His books. His memories. And Brittany had already renamed it. Not Margaret's bedroom. Not the primary bedroom. Future master suite. As though my departure was simply part of the plan. I looked up. Neither Ethan nor Brittany seemed uncomfortable. Not even slightly. That hurt more than I expected. Because it wasn't a careless mistake. It was an assumption. A glimpse into what they truly imagined. A future where they occupied the center. And I occupied the margins. For a moment nobody spoke. Then Brittany broke the silence. We just think the property has so much potential. Potential. There was that word again. Not memories. Not family. Not history. Potential. Value. Opportunity. Assets. I suddenly realized something important. Neither of them was talking about the house anymore. They were talking about ownership. Control. Access. The future. And somehow, in every version of that future, I seemed to matter less and less. Later that evening, after they left, I carried the floor plans into Walter's study. I spread them across the desk. Page after page. Room after room. Someone had spent weeks preparing these. Maybe months. This wasn't a spontaneous idea. It wasn't concern for an aging mother. It wasn't family wanting to reconnect. It was a plan. A real plan. And for the first time since this all began, I stopped asking myself whether Ethan and Brittany wanted something from me. That answer was obvious now. The question that truly mattered was much more troubling. How long had they been planning this? And more importantly, what had they already done behind my back that I still didn't know about? The floor plan sat on Walter's desk for 3 days. 3 days. I didn't throw them away. I didn't confront Ethan. I didn't confront Brittany. I simply studied them. Page after page. Line after line. The longer I looked, the more I noticed. Small details. Tiny assumptions. Clues hidden in plain sight. The plans weren't about improving my home. They were about replacing me. That realization hurt. Not because of Brittany. By then, I expected very little from Brittany. It was Ethan, my son, the little boy who used to run barefoot through these fields. The little boy who once told his kindergarten teacher he lived in a castle. Not because the cottage was large. Because it was home. Somewhere along the way, he'd stopped seeing it that way. And maybe he'd stopped seeing me that way too. The following Thursday, Ethan called. His timing was becoming predictable. Almost professional. Mom. His voice sounded excited. We were thinking about having dinner together this weekend. I smiled quietly. Of course they were. Another meeting. Another conversation. Another attempt. That sounds nice. Great. Then he added something interesting. We can invite a few family members too. Family members. That caught my attention immediately. Because whenever people bring witnesses, they usually want something. Or they want validation. Sometimes both. Saturday evening arrived. I cooked as usual. Roast chicken. Mashed potatoes. Green beans. The same recipes my family had loved for years. By 6 o'clock the house was full. My niece Claire arrived. A couple cousins. Harold. Even Linda Foster. The atmosphere felt warm. Comfortable. Normal. At least on the surface. But underneath? Something was different. I could feel it. The same way you can feel a storm before the clouds arrive. Dinner started pleasantly enough. People laughed. Shared stories. Talked about local events. For nearly an hour, nothing unusual happened. Then Brittany made her move. She waited until everyone was relaxed. Until conversations were flowing naturally. Until attention was centered on the table. Then she smiled. That smile. The one I'd learned to recognize. The smile that always appeared right before an agenda. You know, she said casually, I've been thinking about all the possibilities here. Possibilities. There was that word again. Several people looked up. Brittany continued. This property has incredible potential. I remained silent. She took my silence as encouragement. A mistake. We've been discussing renovation ideas. We. Always we. Never. Asking. Always deciding. Claire glanced toward me. I noticed. Others noticed too. But Brittany kept going. Once we renovate. Once. Not if. Once. One word. One assumption. The room became noticeably quieter. Brittany didn't seem to realize it. Or perhaps she didn't care. She was too focused on the future she'd already built inside her head. She began describing room changes. Kitchen upgrades. Expanded living spaces. Guest accommodations. As though she were presenting plans for a property she already owned. I watched people's reactions. Confusion. Curiosity. Discomfort. Harold looked particularly interested. Probably because he understood exactly what I understood. Then Brittany made another mistake. A much bigger one. She pointed toward the window overlooking Walter's garden. The flower beds would probably need to go. I felt my chest tighten. Not visibly. Not dramatically. Quietly. The way old wounds reopen. The flower beds? Claire asked. Oh, definitely. Brittany nodded. That entire area could be redesigned. Redesigned. I looked out toward the garden. Walter had planted those flowers 23 years ago. One section every spring. One section every anniversary. Every rose bush. Every hydrangea. Every stone border. His hands had touched all of them. And Brittany wanted them removed. Not because they were damaged. Not because they were unhealthy. Because they didn't fit her vision. The room grew even quieter. For the first time that evening, Ethan looked uncomfortable. But not uncomfortable enough to stop her. Not uncomfortable enough to defend anything. Or anyone. He simply sat there. The same way he sat there during the barbecue. The same way he sat there while Brittany mocked my home. Silence had become his favorite form of participation. Then Brittany laughed lightly. Honestly, the property could be worth so much more with the right updates. Worth. More. There it was. Finally. The truth hidden beneath all the concern. Not memories. Not family. Not love. Value. Profit. Potential. Money. Everything suddenly felt very clear. The strange phone calls. The gifts. The pie. The daily attention. The floor plans. Every piece belonged to the same puzzle. And now everyone at the table could see it too. For a moment nobody spoke. Then I reached beside my chair. Slowly. Calmly. I picked up a large manila envelope. The room noticed immediately, because people notice silence, and they notice confidence. I placed the envelope gently on the table, not dramatically, not angrily, just deliberately. Brittany stopped talking. Ethan looked confused. "What is that?" he asked. I smiled. The same smile Walter used to wear whenever he already knew the outcome of something. "Oh." I rested one hand on the envelope. "Just some paperwork." The room remained silent. Brittany's eyes immediately locked onto it. Paperwork. Interesting word. You'd be amazed how quickly people become interested in paperwork when property is involved. Then something unexpected happened. A car door slammed outside. Everyone heard it. Heads turned toward the front window. A moment later, footsteps approached the porch. Steady, confident, purposeful. My heart remained perfectly calm, because unlike everyone else in the room, I knew exactly who was arriving. The front door opened, and as Ethan turned to look, the color slowly drained from his face. Because standing in the doorway was the one person neither he nor Brittany had expected to see. My attorney. And suddenly, for the first time in weeks, I wasn't the one being surprised. The room went completely silent. Not the comfortable kind of silence. The kind that makes people stop breathing for a second. My attorney stepped through the doorway carrying a leather briefcase. His name was Richard Collins. I'd known him for nearly 15 years. Long enough to trust him. Long enough to know he never showed up by accident. Ethan looked confused. Brittany looked alarmed. And for the first time in weeks, neither of them seemed prepared. "Good evening," Richard said politely. I smiled. "Thank you for coming." He nodded and took the empty chair beside me. No one spoke. No one seemed sure what was happening. I let the silence sit for a moment. Then I placed my hand on the manila envelope. "Since we're discussing the future," I said calmly, "this seems like the right time." Across the table, Brittany's smile had disappeared. Ethan looked nervous. The confidence they'd carried into my house was fading quickly. Richard opened his briefcase, removed several documents, and placed them neatly on the table. I could almost hear people's hearts beating, especially Brittany's. "What is all this?" Ethan finally asked. I looked directly at him. "Protection." His forehead creased. Protection from what? That question hurt more than I expected, because deep down he knew. Maybe not everything, but enough. Richard adjusted his glasses. Then he began explaining. Over the previous month, I'd received multiple purchase offers connected to the development project. Several. Not one. Not two. Several. The original offer wasn't even close to the property's actual value. Professional evaluations confirmed it. The land was worth significantly more than anyone had initially offered. A lot more. Around the table, people exchanged glances. Brittany sat perfectly still, like a statue, like someone trying very hard not to react. Richard continued. "Several weeks earlier, after learning more about the development plans, I had made a decision. A very important decision. One that did not involve Ethan. One that did not involve Brittany. And one they clearly hadn't anticipated." I leaned back in my chair. Then I said the words that changed everything. "I sold the development rights." The room froze. Brittany blinked. Ethan stared. For a second, nobody seemed to understand. Then realization arrived. Slowly, painfully. The development rights. Not the house. Not the cottage. Not my home. Only specific development access agreements connected to portions of the property. Enough to secure a substantial financial arrangement. Enough to protect the land. Enough to maintain control. Most importantly, enough to make sure nobody else could make decisions for me. Richard slid another document across the table. The proceeds were placed into a protected trust. That sentence landed like thunder. I watched Brittany's face carefully. The color drained from it. Little by little. A protected trust. Which meant something very important. The money belonged to the trust. Not to Ethan. Not to Brittany. Not to future assumptions. Not to future renovations. Not to anyone expecting an easy path to wealth. Several family members looked stunned. Harold looked impressed. Linda looked relieved. Claire was trying not to smile. Finally, Ethan spoke. His voice sounded different. Smaller. "What does that mean?" Richard answered calmly. "It means the assets are protected. Simple. Clear. Final. No arguments. No loopholes. No shortcuts." The silence that followed felt enormous. Then Brittany made her last mistake. The one she'd been making from the very beginning. She stopped pretending. Only for a second. But long enough. Her disappointment became visible. Not concern. Not sadness. Disappointment. The kind people feel when something valuable slips through their fingers. And everyone at the table saw it. Everyone. For weeks, she had spoken about family, support, care, helping. Now those words suddenly disappeared. Because the opportunity had disappeared. The mask couldn't survive without the prize behind it. I looked around the room. At my family. At the people who had watched everything unfold. Then my eyes settled on Ethan. My son. The hardest part of this story was never Brittany. It was him. Because strangers can disappoint you. People like Brittany can disappoint you. But a child? That's different. A child carries a piece of your heart forever. Even when they break it. For a moment, I saw regret in his eyes. Real regret. Not because of the trust. Not because of the money. Because for the first time, he realized what all of this had cost. Trust. Respect. Connection. Things far more difficult to rebuild than finances. Eventually people began leaving. Quietly. One by one. No arguments. No dramatic confrontations. Just silence. The kind silence that arrives after truth finally enters a room. When the last car disappeared down Willow Creek Road, I stepped outside alone. The evening air felt cool. Peaceful. The fields stretched toward the horizon exactly as they always had. The garden Walter planted still glowed beneath the fading sunset. The porch swing still creaked gently in the breeze. Everything looked the same. Yet somehow everything felt different. Lighter. As if a weight had finally been removed. I walked across the yard and stopped beside Walter's rose garden. The flowers Brittany wanted removed. The flowers she called wasted space. I ran my fingers across a bloom and smiled. Walter used to say something whenever life became difficult. He'd say, "People always reveal what matters most to them." Back then, I thought he meant character. Now I understood he meant choices. Because eventually everyone chooses. Some choose gratitude. Some choose loyalty. Some choose love. And some choose opportunity. The problem comes when they confuse opportunity with entitlement. I looked back at the cottage. My little cottage. The same one Brittany laughed at. The same one Ethan stopped defending. The same one everyone underestimated. And suddenly I found myself smiling. Because they had never really understood what made this place valuable. It wasn't the acreage. It wasn't the development rights. It wasn't the money. It wasn't even the house itself. The real value was the life built inside it. The sacrifices. The memories. The years. The love. Those things could never be measured on a property appraisal. And they could never be transferred through a trust. As the sun disappeared behind the hills, I sat down on the porch swing and watched the evening settle over the land Walter and I had built together. They laughed at my small house. But in the end, the house was never small. Their understanding of it was. And that made all the difference.